Greg Mullen, and I am so excited to have him here. His work totally aligns with the work we talk about here, and he is an active member on the Facebook group, so you guys have probably seen him before. Today we're going to be talking about grading conferences, or I would prefer to call them assessment conferences, and we had some questions to start out with. But when we talk about assessment conferences, what we're really talking about are these opportunities we have to check in with kids about their learning, and doing it in a way that's not just a hi, how you doing? It's like can you point me to the things you've actually learned and how you know you've learned them? So they're starting to really articulate what they know and can do in a way that speaks to our ability to assess and then adjust instruction based on what we learn. So, Greg, what are some of the things that you've done to confer with students, both in person and also now in this COVID environment where we're not doing it in person necessarily?
Yeah, things are definitely different, and all of the sessions you've had have really been targeting that. It's been a really good series, and I'm excited for more of these throughout this school year. But in my experience, the whole idea of shifting that ownership from the teacher telling the student what they do and don't know, and shifting it to checking in with where the student feels they are with what they do and don't know. I mean, your the Google Docs, the Google Forms, the checking in digitally, allowing students to not only answer multiple choice questions, but give written, open feedback that you can then interpret over time. The biggest challenge in doing that I've found as a teacher and now this year as a coach is when you have so many students giving you all of this open feedback, how do you manage it all? And it came to me with this idea, and this is what I tell my teachers, is you're setting an expectation for yourself that's so overwhelming, that giving yourself grace and finding a strategy that allows you to figure out which students need it the most now, which students seem to be capable and moving along that you don't have to spend as much time, but still check in with. And so that art behind this science of teaching students to self-reflect and guide their own learning, it's something that, I've always enjoyed reading your books on how to do that. And so my experience with my experience with doing exactly what we're going to be talking about today has really been in line with what you've been talking about all these years with hacking assessments, teaching students to self-assess. So I'm excited to hear and have a conversation with you about how to get this done this year and work with colleagues and have teachers work with each other so that the expectations are set that are reasonable given the context.
And that actually kind of leads really well into Jamie's first question, which was about how you get students to, how do you give a grade to a student in the first marking period when you've only known them for a short period of time? They really haven't had much opportunity for practice. And I mean, I could make the blanket statement that having grades in the first marking period is counterproductive in a lot of ways, because we don't want to discourage kids by putting maybe where they actually are on there at the onset of changing everything that they're used to seeing and doing. But we also don't want to inflate where they actually are right now based on it. So my suggestion to you, Jamie, is first of all, have some very clear criteria on what the first marking period assessment is going to be on, so that when you have these conversations with kids, first of all, if this is the first time kids are talking about their learning when you're doing these conferences, the first semester conferences are usually not awesome. They kind of take a lot of prompting from the teacher because the kids don't know what to bring or what to say yet. So they take a little bit longer than the ones that will happen throughout the year. And you should plan on that. I mean, if it's going to take you a week during a normal time, once they know, to get through all your students, plan 2 weeks to do it, and fill it in where it makes sense. And especially in this distance learning environment, if you're going to be doing it on Zoom calls with your students, maybe it makes better sense, instead of having a whole class come, you schedule small groups, and maybe for the first marking period, you do small group grading conferences, and we talk about the specific things that we've been learning in class right now, where we are. And you could start this, and this kind of ties in the other question that came up, using a Google form before you start to do those conferences. If you ask really targeted questions and you mention the specific assignments or projects that you've been working on and how they align with standards in the document, you give them an opportunity to click boxes that show which standards you're actually working on. And then you also give them the space to tell you the feedback they've received and how they've applied it. The wealth of information they're going to be coming to those conferences with, because they've had to think about all of those things before you even got to the conference, is better focused time. Conferences could be big time wasters if kids come unprepared, and if you're not prepared for them. So if you're asking them to fill out these forms, but you haven't read the spreadsheet before you sit down with them, you're going to lose precious time, and you're not going to have that efficiency in a process that's already very clunky, because different kids, like Greg was suggesting earlier, are going to have different needs. And some of them are going to get it right away. You might be able to have a conference in 3 to 5 minutes. Others might take 7 to 10 minutes that first time. So I do have a video on my YouTube channel about a first semester conference, which is a far cry from what you would see if you saw the end of year conferences, where kids have now done this for 4 marking periods, 2 semesters worth of work in addition to the midterm conferences that we have, and then the individual conferences that we do for their actual work. And I think even having a conversation with kids before you start this to set the success criteria together, what makes a successful assessment conference, have that conversation with them. Don't be afraid to use class time to discuss where is appropriate for them to be right now, and communicate that information to parents as well, so that when they do look at the report card, they do know exactly what they were with. And oh my God, Matthew, I see that it's you on the Be Live. I don't have to guess at who Facebook user it is. So that's awesome. I don't know if they fixed something, or if, because you've been on here, you are officially a part of who I could see in the chat. So welcome. And I do agree that it is student to student. So Greg, what do you think? Like, based on what you were saying about that grace and the idea that different kids need different things, how could we assess those needs, even kind of predict them before we sit down to have these in-person conferences, either like we're having right now on a Be Live, or, oh, he's saying that you switched over to YouTube. So that's what it is. You're on YouTube, and trick. I could see you on YouTube. That's we know now.
I watched the episode with Matthew. Awesome. Glad to see you on board today. This is really cool, because the conversation that you're having today and the comment that Matthew just made, we're all on point here. And I want to point out that in your book, as I'm listening, I'm like, oh, that's literally on page 11. I went and, because I annotate, I circle, and I wanted to point out that learning how to set an actionable goal is not only something that's hard for some kids, but, thank you, but it's, like Matthew said, varying from student to student based on engagement. Some students are going to have the self-efficacy, the confidence, the skill-based background knowledge for how to set a goal. that the social emotional aspect of this, of the whole child approach to academic learning, I asked a question to a group of people, is it worth taking time away from academic instruction to teach social emotional learning? And I was surprised at the humming and hawing.
If you were talking to secondary teachers, I would not be surprised, but that doesn't make it any less meaningful.
It was a good question.
Right.
And it really gets at it because we're measured by our success with academics. And so all of the focus and pressure is on that. But when we talk about teaching students how to self-reflect, I mean, that's a social or emotional skill. And so to set a lifelong goal to make whatever class you're teaching relevant is a good first step. But in order to do that, we as teachers have to understand, how does this class relate? How is it relevant to a multitude of lifelong goals? And that's just step 1 of 5 to consider. But I wanted to point out real quick, that, for example, when you have students work on shorter goals within the larger thing, you say, for example, let's say a student selects a goal like, I'd like to do better in class. His or her partner may ask, when you say you want to do better in class, what do you mean? Better at what? And in what way? That sort of is almost a scientific process for identifying your goal setting. And having that thought process is something that we as teachers can practice with each other, I think, to identify our goal setting in order to help our students identify goal setting. So I don't know if that addresses the student-to-student difference, the variation that Matthew's talking about. And when you talk about the Google spreadsheet that was asked about, that you shared earlier in the Facebook group, how can we use the Google Docs not only to help students self-reflect, but how can we use the Google Docs to help teachers work with each other to design questions that effectively help students self-reflect?
When we think about dispositional learning and how we kind of bring that in, and it's something that, the Core Collaborative addresses a lot, the company that I work for, this idea that kids come to learning with specific dispositions that they're already good at, but they don't necessarily know how to name them or how to access them in the way that we want them to in an academic setting. So it's helping kids see the things that they're really strong at, and then helping them name them, and then helping them develop them further. And this idea of having an impact team, so to speak, of teachers creating shared questions. And I mean, Matt made a comment about, it took about 4 years for there to be a process in place. And I would definitely say that in that timeline, it's so true. If you're doing it by yourself, it's going to take that long. But if you have multiple teachers on your team doing the same thing in the classes, that 4-year period will get smaller because they'll become accustomed to doing it in more than one space. And it will also build their efficacy around thinking about themselves as learners, that metacognitive element, where it's not just reflection, but it's thinking about the way that they think and the way that they process the learning that's happening, which is really once you could figure that out about yourself, you could really learn anything because you understand how you do it.
That's been something I've been working with teachers on, is the idea of metacognition is so difficult because it requires a competency of cognitive strategies that what we usually do as teachers is we address learning strategies, which is more focused on how we instruct to sort of support what I call passive learning. I know it's a bit of an attack, but the idea of changing that so that you're teaching cognitive strategies, not just learning strategies, but cognitive strategies that can align across disciplines. It gets at the idea of when you start looking at which cognitive strategies you're using, you get to this metacognitive perspective. That's really hard. And it's not something that we can be graded on because not a lot of people know enough about it. And I do like that Matthew said SMART goals is something that he's been using because, again, knowing whether it's specific, whether it's measurable, attainable, relevant and time-based. What do those mean? What does it look like? How is it relevant in my class? And how does my personality as a teacher connect with those things? How do I use those in order to coach my students in associating it with their personality and how they want to use it? Matthew, good point, man.
Yeah, I was actually going through, and when you have a structure in class, when you're teaching goal setting, it makes these conferences a lot more personalized, because if you know the goals that students are setting, and you could ask that in the Google form ahead of time, what are you working on right now? What are the goals that you're focused on? Where is the progress? Like, how much progress have you made toward that goal, and how do you know? What work has helped support practice of that? And the more granular you can get with those kinds of questions, you'll have that body of data before you go into the conference. And that's also what's going to be your time saver after the fact, all the prep you're doing up front. Now, obviously, in a classroom, it's hard to do this because you have other kids in the background who are doing other work, and getting a structure in place that allows you to call one child up at a time to have these conferences takes knowing your kids, setting these structures up. By the last year I was doing it, I had their names on the board, approximate times. I sent an email the night before so that they knew they had to come prepared. If somebody was absent, they knew who came before them and that the line would be moved up. The whole calendar was kind of shared with the whole class. And then we tried to keep with that. If students couldn't make the conference, it was on them to be responsible and say, hey, Ms. Saxton, can we make it another time? Can we do it a different way? Whether at the time we could have been doing it on Google Hangouts, through Voxer sometimes if we had to be asynchronous. And in this time in COVID, if you're seeing your kids like I'm talking to you right now, you're going to have to get creative. So using an app like Voxer, which is free, and if you're on Wi-Fi, you don't have to worry about killing your data. You have an opportunity to have an asynchronous conversation using that walkie-talkie app, because they could listen to it and you could see if they've played your note already and then can respond. And you could do it multiple ways. You could have that voice element, you could do a video, you can type into the text box, you could share documents, you can ask them to even do screencasts if you can't link up at the same time, and then you can provide feedback and the dialogue could go on through the questions that you ask that way. Or the simplest way, I think, would be to schedule meetings on Zoom or whatever platform you're using, Google Meet, or through whatever's working in your district right at this moment, where you give kids very specific times, and then you have a timer, set it on your phone, have an egg timer from the kitchen, whatever you have, old school, new school, and you have to be cognizant of how much time you're spending with each kid. And if the conversation needs more time, you cut it off a couple seconds before the next kid's coming on, and you schedule another time. I love that you have Google Calendar appointments, Matthew. That is a great suggestion, especially if you share that calendar with the class, and then they just have to click on that in their calendar and up comes the invite, which is really, really useful. And it's another skill that they're going to need to be able to do once they leave school, because that's how most of us function in the world. I also am a little embarrassed to admit I have one of these. I have the Google Calendar, which reminds me usually half hour, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. I get the reminders on there and I have everything saved in there. But I also like the paper one, because as I'm trying to figure out what my days are going to look like, I write everything in the paper one, put it into the computer after, and then this just stays open next to me all day. And then this is how nerdy it gets after that. I have this notebook that I keep notes in about what each of those meetings were about. So when I look at the date and the time, it aligns with all the notes and all the different things, as well as, whatever agenda documents that I also have. So it would behoove you to have your Google spreadsheet open from the survey that you started, and have a note section, add another column at the end where once you meet with the students, you put the date, you put the time, you put the specific things you discussed. It doesn't have to be full sentences. It could just be little bullet points. These are the things that we talked about. Highlight things in their answers if you didn't get to it so that you know to go back to it. And then what were the outcomes? What did the students say they were going to commit to? What can you hold them accountable for? And how much time did you give them before you know you're going to follow up? Because that's how you should end every conference. Aside from giving them validating feedback about how they've been working or the specifics that they need to be working in, have time where you are going to follow up and tell them that they could expect you to follow up within a certain time frame so that they know that there's still, that the conversation's not ending here.
Hey, Star, something that you and I have talked about in the past. In fact, this is something that came up in our conversation on the podcast. That something you said was I think definitely relevant to this conversation is to do what you're asking your students to do, and in the realm of goal setting. If you're gonna ask your students to do these Google documents where they reflect on the kinds of goals that they have and what steps they're going to take to meet those goals, and then meet with you to sort of have you hold them accountable and give them some open feedback on how they might improve, would it be beneficial for teachers to find a partner at their school that might hold them accountable?
Oh my God, yes.
And practice asking these open-ended questions about the kinds of goals that they have, practice sort of distinguishing the griping from the progressions that we want to have, that we want to see. What are your thoughts on having teachers exercise these things that we're talking about having students do?
I think in order to really do a great job with kids, this is a practice we need to be in the habit of doing ourselves. And having those partnerships, whether it starts with one teacher who's interested in doing this work as well. When I was in the high school, I started doing all this work with very few of my colleagues were interested in doing this. It seemed like a lot of work. They didn't think that it was going to be terribly useful. And I think it took a lot of time to really help them. And Matt just mentioned the front loading, and it's true. I think if there's anything that I learned over time is that sometimes I jumped too quickly into just giving directions and kind of realized I needed to backtrack a lot when I saw the results of my expectations were up here. And unfortunately, I didn't do a good enough job really expressing how to get here. There was an assumption that they knew how to do it, and I was often wrong with that assumption. So just really, when I started to notice gaps, sort of take a step back, how can I build instruction around that particular gap? And then how can we practice it as a group? And then trying to be transparent by modeling my own practice, which a lot of the time, my practice was an unconscious thing. It was something that I really needed to learn to articulate in a way that was going to be helpful for other people, because I've always been a journaler. I didn't necessarily think about it as reflection as a kid, but that's what it was. I would write every single day. It was a part of my practice in a notebook. Sometimes it was chronicling whatever the events of the day were. Sometimes it was thinking about things that happened, things I could have done differently. And when I became a teacher, oh my God, that was essentially my entire life. Thinking about how lessons worked or didn't work, why they didn't work, how I could make them better. And then when I got more confident and bolder, bringing kids into that conversation where it was like, all right, I'm clearly missing the mark right now. And I could stop class in the middle at the end and say, let's not call this a complete wash. Where do we need to go back to make sure that we get this better? And it's so true. at the same time with these conferences as well, in the beginning, they aren't going to go well.
It's
You
true.
should really
It's
set
true.
yourself up for that understanding. And in this environment as well, when the SEL piece that Greg was mentioning earlier is so important, and we can't see a lot of what's going on, this pandemic has really run a course on all of us. And I know that there are some days I wake up and I'm just off for no particular reason. I just am.
Yeah.
I'm feeling isolated, or I don't feel like I am in a space where I want to be around people. And it's just that sort of that our kids are human beings too. And this is going to have an impact. Maybe someone in their family got sick. Maybe someone they know died. And that's not going to be a good day to talk about their learning. That's going to be a day for you to be checking in with them and saying, you know, what can I do to make it better? How can I ease some of that? And,
that brings up a good point, because I've had teachers tell me when I'm talking about what you just said about checking in with students and seeing how they feel and talking about emotions and feelings and coping, and I get a lot of responses, and you're right, from secondary teachers, that I'm not their psychologist, I'm their academic instructor. That is not my job to see if they're developing emotionally. I don't have a PhD in psychology. I can't do that. I can't be expected to do that. And it's always fun, because when I say, well, do you have a PhD in math or physics or anything like that? And that never goes over well. But the idea is the same, where you have a basic understanding of your own emotional development, and you as an adult developing that understanding in yourself and sharing that with students that are 20, 30, 40 years behind you. Yeah, you can relate. You can find ways to talk to them about stuff that doesn't cross any lines, doesn't cross any boundaries.
Oh, yeah, of course.
And
yeah. So, I mean, going back to your other question, though, about having teacher teams do this work together, I mean, when we have thought partners, we're able to better articulate how we come to these kinds of things so we could share it with students. Plus, anytime you get a practice round before you have to go in to do it for real is super helpful, because there are going to be a lot of curveballs that are going to come up. So, I mean, even if you run those scenarios with somebody else, like a kid sits down in front of you completely unprepared, instead of flipping out on them, which, if you're having a bad day, that could happen.
Yep.
There's got to be a way to either have a protocol for lack of preparation where that person moves to the end of a line. You give them a little bit more time after you maybe uncover why they aren't prepared. And you might be able to be flexible about that. But I do kind of want to circle back around just to do kind of summarizing everything, since we are running out of time now. So the first thing you can do when you're doing conferences in class or distance is have really good front loading, where you create success criteria with students about what makes a good conference. Mm-hmm. Make sure that reflection is a part of learning every single day, not just at the end of things, although that's where it's appropriate. They should be thinking about their learning throughout the process. We also want to get them comfortable with the language of the standards that you're using in class, or the skill set or the learning targets, whichever language you're using with them. Just be consistent. Make sure they know what you're talking about. When you're designing the Google form you're going to use to collect the data, use the same language you've been using in class so that they aren't thrown for a loop when they're by themselves filling it out. And give them time in class to fill them out. This is important stuff, and it could count as reflection to go back through their portfolio of learning at this time. So you really want to make sure that you're honoring the time in class to give them to prepare for these things. Maybe you set two days aside, and if it takes them longer than that, they could do it at home. But really make sure they're using that time in class, whether they're virtual or at home, virtual or in school, to really use the time that's allotted for your learning to be done at that time.
And I know we got a minute here. I just want to throw out things like Desmos things like Flipgrid, things
Mhm.
like Kahoot. They have opportunities for students to do video, written, audio feedback that collects it and chronologically sort of allows you to review student development over time. A lot of great tech tools. There's too many really to list. I think that's the overwhelming nature of this year for moving into this technical version of teaching. And I think that the idea that what tools will help me as a teacher, I think requires an openness for myself as a teacher to say, well, what tools are available to me now, and of those tools, which ones work for me right now?
Right. And there's always going to be new ones too.
Yeah.
So keeping your eyes open for the next new one. And if a student brings it up to you, just say thanks.
Yeah.
So to wrap up for today, I just reposted the Q&A calendar. Next week's topic is teaching reflection and self-assessment, which we all know is close to my heart. We talked a little bit about it today, but we're going to go much deeper next week into the nooks and crannies of how to make it work and how to embed it in instruction. And if you have any specific questions about that, please make sure you get into the document. I hope we answered everybody's question today. Big shout out to Matt, and thank you, Greg, for being my co-host for today's Q&A.